Where did humanity originate? You already know the answer. You have known it since you were born. You carry it in every cell of your body, in every strand of your DNA. But the world has done a remarkable job of obscuring it, complicating it, and sometimes outright denying it. The answer is Africa. Not symbolically African, not metaphorically African. Literally, scientifically, genomically, and archaeologically African. Every human being alive on Earth today, every Scandinavian, every Japanese, every Amazonian, every Australian Aboriginal, every person of every ethnic group on every continent traces their ancestry, without exception, to a population of Homo sapiens that lived in Africa between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago. This is not a hypothesis. It is not contested by serious science. It is not one theory among several equally valid options. It is the most well-evidenced conclusion in the entire history of human science. The fossil record confirms it. The genetic record confirms it. The archaeological record confirms it. Every major scientific body on Earth confirms it. Today we are going to explore how we know this, what the evidence is, when the story began, how our ancestors moved out of Africa and populated the entire world, and what this extraordinary fact means for how we understand ourselves as a species. Welcome to GriotWave Academy. Before we continue, it is important to understand the mission behind GriotWave Academy. This platform was created to preserve knowledge, culture, music, and stories that often go unheard or are forgotten. GriotWave is not just about content. It is about building independent systems of learning, creativity, and empowerment. Through books, audio, technology, and media, the goal is to transform timeless wisdom into practical tools for today's generation and future generations. Before we get to the evidence, I need you to understand the time scale we are operating on, because our intuition about time is catastrophically bad when it comes to deep time. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Life has been on Earth for about 3.5 billion years. Multicellular life for about 600 million years. Mammals for about 200 million years. Primates for about 65 million years. The human lineage diverged from chimps about 7 million years ago. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens appeared about 300,000 years ago. Now consider recorded history. Everything you learned in school about Greece, Rome, Egypt, China covers maybe 5,000 years. That is 1.7% of our species' existence. Our entire written history is a tiny sliver at the very end of a very long story. And the story before writing? The story of the 295,000 years before anyone carved a hieroglyph or laid a brick in Babylon? That story took place almost entirely in Africa. Every tool that was made, every fire that was lit, every funeral that was held, every child that was born and raised, every language that was spoken, all of it, for most of our history, in Africa. We are an African species, not as metaphor, as chronological fact. The out-of-Africa migration 70,000 years ago was so recent in evolutionary time that we can still read it in our DNA. The populations that left Africa have been outside for less than 1/4 of our species' total history. The populations that stayed in Africa have been there for all of it. The fossil record makes one thing absolutely clear. The oldest human fossils are African, and they are significantly older than fossils found anywhere else on Earth. Jebel Irhoud in Morocco is the current record holder, 315,000 years old. When these fossils were redated in 2017 using thermoluminescence on burnt flint tools found alongside them, it caused genuine excitement in the paleoanthropology community because it pushed human origins back 100,000 years further than the previous consensus, and located it not in East Africa, where most researchers had focused, but in North Africa. This is important. Jebel Irhoud is in Morocco. Morocco is in the Sahara region. The implication is that Homo sapiens was already spread across a large part of Africa 315,000 years ago, that our species did not evolve in a single small pocket of East Africa and then spread, but may have emerged across a broad interconnected network of African populations. This is called the, quote, Pan-African model of human origins, and it is currently the most scientifically supported framework. It says, Africa as a whole is our crucible. Different populations across the continent were in contact, exchanged genes and culture, and together produced the modern human lineage. Blombos Cave in South Africa adds another dimension. This is not just about bones. This is about behavior. 100,000-year-old ochre pieces with geometric engravings, abstract art, shell beads, jewelry, pressure-flaked stone tools of extraordinary sophistication. These are behaviors we associate with modern humans. And they are African. And they are ancient. Let me introduce you to our family. Not in metaphor, in science. Because one of the things that modern paleoanthropology has done is actually construct our family tree with remarkable accuracy. The story begins 7 million years ago in Africa. Sahelanthropus chidensis, found in Chad in 2001, walking upright. On the human side of the split with chimpanzees. This is our oldest known ancestor. Then Australopithecus, 4 to 2 million years ago. Multiple species, all African. Lucy A. afarensis, found in Ethiopia in 1974, is still the most famous hominid fossil in history. She walked upright, made rudimentary use of the landscape, and had a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. But she was ours. She was us, in the way that a great-great-great-grandmother is us. Different, but family. Homo habilis, 2.4 million years ago, is the first member of our actual genus, the first stone toolmaker. Handyman. And then Homo erectus, 1.8 million years ago, who did something remarkable, left Africa. Homo erectus fossils are found in the Republic of Georgia, in China, in Indonesia. Africa was already launching species into the world nearly 2 million years ago. The crucial point, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens share a common ancestor, Homo heidelbergensis. In Africa, H. heidelbergensis evolved into us. In Europe, it evolved into Neanderthals. We are not descended from Neanderthals. We are their cousins. The family split happened in Africa, from an African ancestor. Everything about this tree has African roots. The genetic evidence is, if anything, even more powerful than the fossil evidence, because genetics provides a kind of continuous record of population history that fossils can only approximate. The most important single genetic fact about human origins. Africa contains more genetic diversity than all other regions of the world combined. Read that again slowly. All of Europe, all of Asia, all of the Americas, all of Oceania, combined, less genetic diversity than sub-Saharan Africa alone. Why? Because diversity accumulates over time. The longer a population has been in a place, the more genetic variance it will have generated through natural mutation and recombination. Africa's populations have been there for 300,000 years. Populations outside Africa have been there for at most 70,000 years. The difference in diversity directly reflects the difference in time. Mitochondrial Eve is one of the most misunderstood concepts in science. She was not the first woman. She was not alone. She was one of perhaps tens of thousands of women alive at her time. But she is the one whose matrilineal line, mothers to daughters to granddaughters, survived unbroken to the present day. All other matrilineal lines eventually died out. Hers persisted. She lived in Africa, between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. Y chromosome Adam. Same principle for the paternal line. Recent analysis of the Y chromosome found in men from Cameroon showed a branching so ancient that it pushed Adam's date back to 340,000 years, older than the oldest known Homo sapiens fossils. The resolution of this apparent paradox, human genetic diversity, predates our species as currently defined. We have been an interconnected, evolving lineage in Africa for longer than we have been Homo sapiens. Mitochondrial Eve. The name alone carries weight. The name is a deliberate echo of the biblical Eve. But the scientific reality is more profound and less literal than the Genesis story. She was not the only woman. She was not in a garden. She did not have a partner named Adam in any contemporaneous sense. Y chromosome Adam lived possibly hundreds of thousands of years before or after her. She was an ordinary African woman, living in a community of humans, hunting and gathering, raising children, doing what humans have always done. What made her special was not her own life. It was the statistical outcome of 200,000 years of reproduction. Of all the matrilineal lines of all the women who have ever lived, hers is the one that survived. Not because she was the strongest, or the most fertile, or the most blessed, but because of the random statistical accident that her daughters had daughters who had daughters who had daughters, without interruption, all the way to you. The 1987 paper that identified her, by Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson, was one of the most controversial scientific publications of the 20th century. Not because the science was bad, the science was groundbreaking, but because it confirmed, definitively, that all human beings descend from Africans. Some people were not pleased. 20 years of subsequent research, with vastly better genomic tools, has confirmed every conclusion of that 1987 paper, and pushed Eve's African identity even deeper into the data. The Khoisan San people of southern Africa carry the oldest known mitochondrial DNA haplogroup on Earth. Their DNA is the trunk from which all other human DNA branches. Whatever you thought your ancestry was, this is also your ancestry. She is your grandmother. She was African. The Great Rift Valley is one of the most dramatic geological features on Earth, and it may have been the single most important geographic factor in human evolution. The East African Rift runs 6,000 kilometers from Ethiopia to Mozambique. It is the crack where the African continent is slowly pulling apart. In perhaps 10 million years, East Africa will become a separate island continent the way Madagascar did millions of years before. But that slow splitting has shaped human destiny. Here is how. Approximately 5 to 8 million years ago, the formation of the rift created a rain shadow effect. The western side of the rift, what is now the Congo Basin, remained humid and forested. The eastern side, what is now the East African savanna and the Rift Valley itself, became progressively drier, more open, and more seasonally variable. For our arboreal ape ancestors, this created an evolutionary pressure: adapt to the more open environment or stay in the forest. The ones that adapted to the savanna began walking upright. Bipedalism is advantageous on open ground, where you need to see over grass and carry food long distances. They began using tools. When you can't use your hands for locomotion, you can use them for making and carrying implements. Their brains began to grow. The variable, challenging savanna environment selected for cognitive flexibility. The Rift Valley's lakes are equally important. Turkana, Tanganyika, Malawi. These enormous freshwater bodies provided stable food and water resources when the surrounding landscape dried out during glacial cycles. The lakeshore communities may have been the specific populations that made the crucial evolutionary leaps. The geology of the rift also preserves fossils beautifully. Volcanic ash layers and lake sediments create an ideal archive. That is why we find more hominid fossils in the Rift Valley than anywhere else on Earth. Jebel Irhoud is the site that rewrote the human origin story in 2017, and the rewriting is important. Until 2017, the consensus was that Homo sapiens emerged approximately 200,000 years ago in East Africa, specifically from a population in or around Ethiopia. The fossils from Homo kibish in Ethiopia, dated to 196,000 years ago, were considered the oldest known modern humans. Then Jean-Jacques Hublin's team redated Jebel Irhoud, 315,000 years old. In Morocco, the oldest known Homo sapiens fossils are in Northwest Africa, not East Africa. The 2017 paper in Nature did not just push the date back, it challenged the entire single-origin model of human evolution. Because if Homo sapiens was already in Morocco 315,000 years ago, and also in Ethiopia 196,000 years ago, and also in South Africa 100,000 plus years ago, then the species was not emerging from a single isolated population in one corner of the continent. The current best model, Africa as a whole, was the human nursery. Multiple interconnected populations across the continent were sharing genes, sharing culture, sharing innovations. The Sahara, which today is a barrier, went through green periods during wet climatic phases when it was covered in vegetation, rivers, and lakes. During these periods, populations that had been separated reconnected, exchanged genes, and accelerated their evolution. We emerged from all of Africa, not a garden, a continent. I want to address the debate that some people imagine still exists about human origins, the multi-regional hypothesis versus out of Africa, because understanding why that debate is settled, and how it was settled, tells you a great deal about how science works. The multi-regional hypothesis was proposed seriously in the 1980s by Milford Wolpoff and Alan Thorne. It was not a crackpot theory. It was a legitimate scientific hypothesis supported by some fossil evidence, and it was rigorously tested. It said, modern humans didn't all come from Africa recently. Instead, local populations of Homo erectus that had been living in Asia and Europe for over 1 million years evolved independently into modern humans in their respective regions, with enough gene flow across regions to maintain species unity. Under this model, Chinese people are descended from Chinese Homo erectus. European people are descended from European Homo erectus. The genetics destroyed this model, comprehensively and unambiguously. If populations in China and Europe and Africa had been evolving separately for 1.8 million years, they should show enormous genetic differences, far more than we actually see. The amount of genetic variation between modern human populations is extraordinarily small for a species our age. Chimpanzees, which have been in Africa for the same amount of time, show far more genetic diversity between populations than humans show globally. This tiny genetic diversity is only possible if we all descended from a small African founding population in the relatively recent past. The nuance is the interbreeding. Neanderthals contributed 2 to 4% of the genome of non-African humans. Denisovans contributed up to 5% of the genome of some Pacific Islander and Asian populations. But this is ancestry, not origin. The architecture of our genome is African. The small Neanderthal and Denisovan contributions are modifications to an African template. The genetic diversity argument is the most mathematically elegant evidence for out of Africa, and it is the one that is hardest to challenge, because the pattern appears in every genomic dataset ever collected. The pattern is called a diversity gradient. Genetic diversity decreases as you move away from Africa. Populations near Africa are more genetically diverse than populations far from Africa. The further from Africa, the less diverse. This is not a small effect. It is a massive, consistent, reproducible finding across decades of research. The mechanism is called a founder effect or bottleneck. When a small group of people leaves a population and moves to a new location, they carry only a sample of the original population's genetic variation. Their descendants will show less diversity than the original population. Each subsequent migration, from Africa to the Middle East, from the Middle East to Europe, from the Middle East to Asia, from Asia to the Americas, reduces diversity further. The San people of southern Africa, the Khoisan, represent the deepest branch of the human genetic tree. Their mitochondrial DNA haplogroup, L0, is the most ancient known. Their genetic divergence from other human populations predates the main expansion of modern humans out of Africa. In a very real sense, if you want to find the people whose genes are most similar to the ancestral human population, the people our whole species descended from, you would look at the Khoisan San. There is a medical consequence that should urgently concern the world. 95% of medical genetics research has been conducted on people of European ancestry. But Europeans represent the least genetically diverse major population on Earth, a tiny slice of human genetic variation. The treatments, drug dosages, and disease risk models derived from European genomics may not work for Africans. We are conducting human genetics on the wrong population. Paleoanthropologists can read millions of years of evolution in a single fossilized skull. Let me explain how. The cranial volume, the amount of space inside the skull, is the most direct proxy for brain size. And brain size in the hominin lineage tells a dramatic story. From 380 cubic centimeters in Australopithecus to 1,350 in modern Homo sapiens. That is a 3.5-fold increase over 4 million years. For comparison, a chimpanzee brain is about 395 cc, roughly where we started. What drove the increase? It is almost certainly linked to dietary change. When earlier hominids began incorporating more animal protein into their diet, through scavenging first, then active hunting, they gained access to the high-energy, high-quality nutrients that the energetically expensive brain tissue requires. The brain is 2% of body weight, but consumes 20% of resting energy. To grow a bigger brain, you need richer food, animal protein and cooked food, which dramatically increases caloric availability, provided it. The emergence of the distinctively modern human skull shape, the high forehead, the flat face, the chin, the globular brain case, is one of the most significant morphological transitions in primate evolution. And when you map where that transition occurred, Africa, the fossils that first show the modern human skull shape are all African. The transition from archaic to modern skull morphology happened in Africa, in our immediate ancestors, before any migration out of the continent. The chin is particularly interesting. No other primate has a chin. Chins may have evolved in response to the reduction of the jaw, as our diet changed, and our face flattened. Or they may be a byproduct of the reduced stress on the jaw from cooking food. Either way, the chin is a specifically Homo sapiens feature, and it first appears in Africa. The San people, sometimes called Bushmen, though they prefer San or their own group names like Juhansi, Kung, or Kwe, are, according to every genetic analysis ever conducted, the human group most closely related to the ancestral population from which all of humanity descends. Think about what that means. Every human being on Earth, every person who has ever lived in recorded history, shares a more recent common ancestor with every other human being than any of them shares with the San lineage. The San are the oldest branch, the trunk, if you will, from which every other human genetic lineage grows. Their mitochondrial DNA haplogroup L0 diverged from all other human haplogroups between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. That is before the major out-of-Africa migration. That is before most of the African population structure we see today. The San lineage was already ancient before our ancestors were painting caves in France. And then consider what colonialism did to these people. The people with the deepest roots in the human story, who have been in southern Africa for over 150,000 years, who have accumulated 30,000 years of rock art, who maintain ecological knowledge built up over millennia. Their land was taken by Dutch colonists from 1652 onward. Their children were forcibly removed to missions and boarding schools in the 19th and 20th centuries. Some San groups were pushed to near extinction through direct violence and disease. The people who are closest to the origin of all humanity have been treated by the world as its least important members. If there is a more profound indictment of colonialism's perversion of human values, I have not heard it. Every major technological innovation in prehistoric human history was made first in Africa. Every single one. The oldest stone tools in the world, Lomekwi, Kenya, 3.3 million years old, predating Homo habilis, found by Sonia Harman's team in 2015. Africa. The Acheulean hand axe, the first standardized, symmetrically shaped tool, a technical masterpiece that requires abstract thinking. You have to hold a mental template of the desired shape and work backwards from a lump of rock to create it. Originating at Kokisile, Kenya, 1.76 million years ago. Spreading from Africa to Europe and Asia. Persisting for 1.5 million years, the most successful technology in human history. The composite tool, where you have to stone point onto a wooden handle. This requires understanding of adhesives, binding materials, and the physics of a hafted spear. In Africa, from approximately 500,000 years ago. In Europe, only from around 300,000 years ago. The bow and arrow, Sibutu Cave, South Africa, 71,000 years ago. Bone points with adhesive traces. The bow is a machine. It converts the energy of a bent beam into kinetic energy of a projectile. The people who made this 71,000 years ago understood applied physics. And ochre. Iron oxide pigment, ground and mixed, used for non-functional purposes 285,000 years ago in Zambia. This is the first evidence of symbolic behavior in the human lineage. Using a substance for meaning, for decoration, for ritual, for communication, rather than for survival. This is what distinguishes humans from every other animal. And it began in Africa. 74,000 years ago, humanity almost ended. The Toba supervolcano in Sumatra erupted. Not a volcano in the ordinary sense. This was a supervolcano, a caldera collapse that released 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. For comparison, the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption released approximately 1 cubic kilometer. Toba was 2,800 times more powerful. The ash blanketed South Asia in a layer meters deep. Sunlight was blocked. Temperatures dropped globally. Crops failed, though there were no crops, because this was 74,000 years ago. What failed was vegetation. What died was the food chain. Stanley Ambrose's Toba catastrophe theory proposes that the global human population dropped to perhaps 10,000 individuals. Maybe less. We were in genuine danger of extinction. You are here today because some of those individuals, a small group, probably concentrated in Africa, survived. Their descendants are every human being alive today. Every person who has ever lived since 74,000 years ago descends from those survivors. The genetic evidence for this bottleneck is visible. Humans today show remarkably little genetic diversity compared to other great apes, suggesting our entire species descended from a small founding population in the relatively recent past. The bottleneck hypothesis is consistent with the genomic data. What is also important, the post-Toba recovery. Within relatively few generations, those survivors rebuilt, innovated, and accelerated. The Hauisin's port tradition in South Africa, sophisticated microliths, composite tools, symbolic art, dates to just after Toba. As if the survivors, having come so close to extinction, unleashed an extraordinary burst of innovation. The out-of-Africa migration is the greatest journey in the history of life on Earth. Not the most dramatic, not the fastest, but the most consequential. Because this journey populated the entire world. A small group of people, the genetic evidence says perhaps 1,000 to 10,000 individuals, left Africa approximately 65,000 to 70,000 years ago. Every non-African human being alive today descends from this group. The entire genetic ancestry of every European, every East Asian, every Native American, every Pacific Islander, traces back to this relatively small founding population. Why did they leave? Almost certainly climate and sea level. Around this time, lower sea levels during the Ice Age created accessible land connections and shallow crossings. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait between eastern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula may have been only 12 kilometers wide, crossable by people with simple rafts or even strong swimmers. The Arabian Peninsula, then lush and green due to different climate patterns, beckoned. Once in Arabia, the first migrants had a choice of routes: northward into the Levant and eventually Europe, or eastward along the coast toward India, Southeast Asia, and Australia. The genetic evidence strongly supports the coastal route being first. Australian Aboriginal populations carry genetic signatures that suggest their ancestors arrived approximately 50,000 BP, not long after the initial migration. From Africa to Australia, 15,000 years. 15,000 years of movement along coastlines, across archipelagos, following the richest ecological zone on Earth, the tidal interface between land and sea. These were not primitive wanderers lost in the landscape. They were skilled maritime foragers, fishers, navigators, and adapters.
When our ancestors left Africa and moved into Europe and Western Asia, they were not moving into empty territory. They were moving into a world that had already been inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years by our closest evolutionary relatives, the Neanderthals. Neanderthals were not the primitive brutes of popular imagination, the stooped, club-wielding cavemen. They were a sophisticated human species. They buried their dead, placing bodies in graves, sometimes with flowers. They cared for their injured and elderly. Neanderthal skeletons show healed injuries that would have required extended nursing care to survive. They used ochre for body decoration. They made jewelry from eagle talons and shells. They possibly made cave paintings. They also had slightly larger brains than us, and they had been living in Europe and Western Asia for 400,000 years, adapting to Ice Age conditions, developing the Mousterian tool tradition. They were not in any sense inferior to our African ancestors. They were differently evolved for a different environment. When the two groups met, around 50,000 to 40,000 years ago in the Middle East and later in Europe, they interbred. Not occasionally, regularly enough that the genetic contribution is detectable. Every person of non-African ancestry today carries 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. And this DNA was not junk. The Neanderthal genes that survived in modern human genomes cluster in functional regions: immune system genes, skin and hair genes, metabolism genes. Natural selection retained the Neanderthal variants because they were useful for surviving in the Eurasian environment. Our African ancestors were enhanced by their encounter with the Neanderthals. Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago, but they never really disappeared. They are in your genome right now.
Before we continue, if you are a builders, creators, entrepreneurs, purpose-driven individuals, the GriotWave Inner Circle is now open. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, courses, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, and this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video. In 2010, paleoanthropology had one of its most extraordinary moments of the 21st century. And it came from a finger bone found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. Svante Pääbo's team, the team that would later win the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for ancient DNA research, sequenced its mitochondrial DNA. The sequence was unlike any known human. It wasn't Neanderthal. It wasn't Homo sapiens. It was something else. A third human species, previously unknown to science, revealed not by a spectacular skull or complete skeleton, but by the genome extracted from a single finger bone. We named them Denisovans, after the cave. We know almost nothing about their physical appearance. We have a handful of fossils and a lot of DNA. But the DNA tells extraordinary stories. Denisovans interbred with our ancestors in East and Southeast Asia. Melanesian populations, Papua New Guineans, Australian Aboriginals, some Fijians and Polynesians carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. This is a larger archaic contribution than the Neanderthal contribution to Europeans. And the Tibetans. The ability to live at high altitude depends critically on a variant of the EPAS1 gene that regulates oxygen metabolism. This variant is nearly universal among Tibetans, and rare in all other populations. Where did Tibetans get it? From Denisovans. Inbreeding between our ancestors and Denisovans in Central Asia transmitted this gene variant, which natural selection then rapidly spread through the Tibetan population, because it was so advantageous at altitude. Without Denisovan DNA, Tibetan civilization may not exist. This is what ancient human diversity gave us: useful adaptations. The diversity of the human family, African, Neanderthal, Denisovan, enriched the surviving species. Here is a puzzle that has occupied paleoanthropologists for decades. We have fossils of anatomically modern Homo sapiens going back 315,000 years. But the full expression of what we might call modern human behavior, art, music, complex ritual, long-distance trade, technological innovation, does not appear fully in the record until much more recently. Why the gap? The answer is what researchers call behavioral modernity, and it is the key transition in human history. Somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, the evidence keeps pushing the date earlier. A cognitive threshold was crossed. Not a single mutation, not a single moment, but a gradual accumulation of cognitive capacity that eventually reached a tipping point: symbolic thought. Symbolic thought is the ability to use one thing to represent another. A red mark on your skin means, I belong to this group. A carved necklace means, I have high status. A story around the fire means, our group came from the sky, and here's what that means for how we live. Once you can do this, once you can make symbols and interpret symbols and build shared symbolic worlds, you can have language, religion, law, art, money, science. Every cultural institution depends on symbolic thought, and the capacity for this thought emerged in Africa. We know this because the archaeological evidence for symbolic thought, ochre workshops, shell beads, engraved geometric patterns, complex ritual disposal of the dead, appears first in Africa and then spreads with the out-of-Africa migration. Language was not invented at a single moment. It evolved gradually, becoming more complex as social groups became more complex. But full modern language, with its recursive grammar, its ability to talk about abstract concepts and distant events and possible futures, is estimated to have emerged somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago. In Africa, the ancient DNA revolution is one of the most transformative developments in the history of science, and it has strengthened the African origins story at every turn. Svante Pääbo won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022 for developing techniques to extract and sequence DNA from ancient fossils. This is technically extraordinarily difficult, DNA degrades rapidly after death, and the fragments that remain after thousands of years are contaminated with environmental DNA and bacterial DNA and the DNA of every researcher who has ever handled the specimen. Separating genuine ancient human DNA from this noise required decades of methodological development. But once Pabo's team succeeded, the results were transformative. From a 40,000-year-old Neanderthal bone, a complete Neanderthal genome. From a 41,000-year-old finger bone, an entirely new human species. These discoveries could not have been made any other way. You cannot tell species and subspecies apart from skull shape alone when the differences are subtle. Now, a single ancient fossil can tell you extraordinary things: sex, age, pigmentation, ancestry, disease exposure, family relationships, geographic origins. The language of the fossils is being decoded at the molecular level. But there is a painful irony that I need to name. Most ancient DNA research has been done in Europe and Asia. Why? Because cold climates preserve DNA better. A 40,000-year-old Siberian bone preserves DNA well. A 50,000-year-old East African bone, in warm, humid conditions, often yields no recoverable DNA. The origin story is being told with less data from the origin. African ancient DNA recovery is improving, environmental DNA from cave sediments, enamel dentine analysis. But there is a substantial gap in our knowledge of African population history before 10,000 years ago. The most important question in human origins is being answered with the least African primary data. This needs to change. The evolution of the human brain is one of the most dramatic events in the 4 billion year history of life on Earth. A 3.5-fold increase in brain volume over 4 million years. From a brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's to the most complex known structure in the universe. The energy cost of this expansion is staggering. Your brain, right now, just existing, doing nothing particularly demanding, is consuming 20% of your resting energy. It does this constantly. Growing that brain required our ancestors to find dramatically richer food sources than our Australopithecine ancestors had access to. 2 innovations made the final expansion possible. First, eating more animal protein through improved hunting technology. High-quality animal fat and protein provide the building blocks for neural tissue. Second, cooking. The discovery that cooking food dramatically increases its caloric availability was, in terms of calories per hour of foraging, the most important technological discovery in human prehistory. Richard Wrangham's cooking hypothesis suggests that without fire the human brain could not have reached its current size. Robin Dunbar's social brain hypothesis is fascinating. He found that across all primates, brain size correlates with social group size. Not with tool use, not with environmental complexity, with social complexity. Primates with larger groups have larger brains. His conclusion: the human brain evolved primarily to manage complex social relationships. To track 150 people's relationships, alliances, debts, and status. Politics, not technology, drove our brain evolution. And the final point: all human brains are equal. There is no population on Earth with a cognitively superior brain architecture. The science on this is not ambiguous, not contested, not uncertain. It is settled. Racial differences in cognitive ability are not supported by any scientific evidence, and are contradicted by enormous amounts of evidence. The human brain evolved once, in Africa, and all human beings carry the same magnificent instrument. The linguistic evidence for African origins is often overlooked, but it is as powerful as the genetic evidence. In 2011, Quentin Atkinson published a study in Science that did for language what genetics had done for DNA. He analyzed phoneme diversity, the variety of distinct sounds used, in 504 languages across the world. The finding was striking. Phoneme diversity decreases with distance from Africa, exactly as genetic diversity decreases with distance from Africa. The most phonemically diverse languages on Earth, the ones with the most distinct sounds, are African. The Finsa-Dicher language of the Kalahari has approximately 112 distinct phonemes. English has around 44. This extraordinary diversity mirrors the genetic story. Africa has the most phonemic variation, because Africa has been inhabited the longest and has had the most time to generate diversity. The click languages of the Khoisan are particularly significant. These languages, with their 5 types of click consonants, each appearing in multiple voiced and unvoiced forms, are the world's most phonologically complex. And they belong to the oldest known human language family, with the deepest divergence from all other languages. There is a hypothesis. I present it as speculation, because it is that the first human language used clicks. The argument: clicks are the most marked sounds in human language. They appear only in the oldest lineages. All other languages may have simplified from a click using ancestral language. If true, then every word ever spoken in every language on Earth is a simplified descendant of click-filled African speech. Whether or not this specific hypothesis is correct, the broader point stands. All human language traces to Africa. Every poem, every prayer, every scientific paper, every declaration of love ever spoken. They all descend from the first words spoken by the first people who had language. Those people were African. We are all African. I don't say this as a slogan or a political statement. I say it as the most precisely verified conclusion of contemporary science. The mathematics of genealogy is extraordinary. Work by statistician Douglas Road and colleagues has shown that the, quote, identical ancestors point, the moment in history when every living human is either an ancestor of all living humans or an ancestor of none, was approximately 3,500 years ago. 3,500 years ago, there were people alive who were in the direct ancestry of every person alive today. They lived primarily in Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. You are descended from them. So is your neighbor. So is the president. So is the poorest person on Earth. The genetic distances between human populations are real. They can be measured with great precision. But they are tiny in the context of mammalian biology. Chimpanzee populations show far greater genetic differentiation between groups than any human populations show. The genetic differences between a Nigerian and a Norwegian, a Japanese person and a Brazilian, they are real, they exist. They reflect 70,000 years of separate history. But they represent a fraction of a percent of the total genome. The common inheritance, shared by all human beings because we are all descended from the same African population, is vastly larger than any differences. And the claim that races differ in intelligence or fundamental capacity, it is not just politically wrong, it is scientifically incoherent. The human brain evolved once, in Africa. All human populations have had the same brain for the same amount of time. The genetic variants that differ between populations, skin color, hair texture, lactase persistence, altitude adaptation, are recent, superficial, and overwhelmingly the result of specific environmental selection. They are not correlated with cognitive ability. Full stop. Let me now connect the science to its civilizational implications, because the data I have just presented has profound consequences for how we understand Africa's place in human history. 77% of all Homo sapiens history happened exclusively in Africa. 77%. Not the beginning, 77% of the total duration. When people think of human history and picture ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, the Roman Empire, they are picturing the most recent 1 to 2% of human existence. The 300,000 years before writing? Before agriculture? Before cities? All of that happened in Africa. The development of language, the development of symbolic thought, the development of complex social organization, the development of technology, all of this was African. The oldest stone tools in the world, Kenya, 3.3 million years ago. The oldest symbolic art, South Africa, 100,000 plus years ago. The oldest jewelry, North Africa, approximately 130,000 years ago. Every first in human technological and cultural history that predates 70,000 years ago is African by definition, because no humans existed outside Africa before 70,000 years ago. Africa's genetic diversity, greater than all other continents combined, reflects this antiquity. Africa's linguistic diversity, approximately 2,000 languages, more than any other continent, reflects it as well. Diversity is what you get from time. Africa has the most time. The narrative that Africa was a static, unchanging prehistorical place until the arrival of Europeans, a narrative that shaped colonial ideology and is still embedded in too many history textbooks, is directly contradicted by every line of scientific evidence. Africa was not prehistorical. It was the origin and primary theater of human history for 300,000 years. 5 myths. 5 quick debunks. Myth 1. Humans evolved from apes. No. We share a common ancestor with chimps, which lived 7 million years ago. That ancestor was not a chimp. Chimps and humans are evolutionary cousins, not parent and child. A useful analogy. You did not evolve from your cousin. You share grandparents. Myth 2. Different races evolved separately in different regions. This is the multi-regional hypothesis, which the genetic evidence destroyed. All modern humans descend from African populations within the past 300,000 years. The differences between populations represent 70,000 years at most of separate evolution, a tiny fraction of our history, and are overwhelmingly superficial adaptations to local environments. Myth 3. Neanderthals were stupid brutes. They were not. They buried their dead. They cared for their sick. They had larger brains than us. They survived Ice Age Europe for 400,000 years. They were a sophisticated human civilization, and their genes, 1 to 4% of every non-African genome, are part of you. Myth 4. The out-of-Africa migration was a single event. It was not. Multiple dispersals, multiple waves, interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, possible subsequent migrations. The story is complex, ongoing, and still being revised as new evidence emerges. Myth 5. African people are less evolved because they stayed. This is the most pernicious myth, and it is scientifically incoherent. Evolution has no direction. There is no more evolved. African populations have been evolving for 300,000 years and carry more genetic variation than all other populations combined. Claiming that remaining in Africa means stasis is the opposite of what the science shows. 8 independent lines of evidence, all pointing to the same conclusion, all confirming each other. This is how science achieves certainty, not through a single proof, but through the convergence of independent evidence streams. Line 1. Fossils. The oldest human bones are African. Jebel Irhoud, 315,000 years old. The oldest non-African human fossils. Mislia Cave in Israel, approximately 180,000 years old. Africa is 135,000 years older. Line 2. Genetic diversity. Africa contains more genetic diversity than all other continents combined. This is mathematically impossible under any model except out of Africa. Lines 3 and 4. Mitochondrial and Y chromosome lineages both trace to Africa between 150,000 and 340,000 years ago. Line 5. The diversity gradient. Genetic diversity decreases with distance from Africa. This is the forensic signature of serial founder effects. Populations losing diversity with each migration further from the origin. It has been found in hundreds of genomic studies across 30 years. Line 6. The hominid lineage. Not just Homo sapiens. Every species in our direct ancestry is African. Australopithecus, Africa. Homo habilis, Africa. Homo erectus, originated in Africa, spread outward. Homo heidelbergensis, Africa, and then Europe. The entire lineage is African. Lines 7 and 8. Technology and language. Both show the same African origin, with diversity decreasing as you move away. 8 independent evidence streams. Same answer. This is not a hypothesis. This is scientific knowledge, of the highest confidence. The science of human origins is not politically neutral, and I want to be honest about that. The question, quote, where did humanity originate, was, for 300 years of European intellectual history, answered with the answer that European imperial interests required. In the 18th and 19th centuries, mainstream European science promoted polygenism, the idea that different human races had separate, independent origins. Under this framework, white Europeans were not descended from black Africans. The races were separate species, with separate origins and inherently different capacities. This was not the position of fringe racists. This was mainstream science. It was taught at Harvard, debated at the Royal Society, cited in courtrooms to justify slavery, and used as the intellectual foundation for colonial projects that killed tens of millions of people. It was, of course, wrong. Catastrophically, murderously wrong. Every assertion it made has been disproven by 100 years of genetics, paleoanthropology, and comparative anatomy. But the resistance to the correct story persisted, even after the evidence was clear. When Raymond Dart announced the discovery of Australopithecus africanus in 1924, a hominid species from South Africa that was clearly on the path to humanity, the British scientific establishment initially rejected it. The most powerful paleoanthropologists of the era were convinced that human origins lay in Asia or Europe, not Africa. It took decades for Dart's correct finding to be accepted. And even now, in 2024, the educational system in most of the world does not teach children that all human beings are African. The history textbooks position Africa as the periphery, not the origin. The pedagogical work of this scientific revolution is not finished. You are part of finishing it. A quick reference for all the key sites and dates in the human origins story. A few highlights. Lomekwi, Kenya, 3.3 million years ago. Stone tools made by a species that predates Homo, possibly Australopithecus or Kenyanthropus. This is the beginning of the technological record, and it is in Africa. Jebel Irhoud, 315,000 years ago. The starting line of our species. In Morocco, North Africa, not East Africa, already telling us that Homo sapiens was distributed across the continent from the start. Lombo's Cave, 100,000 plus years ago. Ochre workshops, shell beads, engraved geometric art, the beginning of symbolic culture. In South Africa, Sibudu Cave, 71,000 years ago. The bow and arrow, a machine that stores and releases energy. In South Africa, the pattern across all 15 sites. Africa, 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 Africa. Then one site in Israel, School, Kafsa, 120,000 to 90,000 BP. Early modern humans who left Africa but apparently didn't survive. And one in Australia, 50,000 BP, the first establishment of modern humans on a new continent. Africa is not just the beginning of the story. Africa is 77% of the story by time. We are almost at the end, and I want to spend a few minutes on what all of this science means. Not just as academic knowledge, but as a framework for understanding the world. First, primacy, not periphery. Every framing of Africa as developing, as emerging, as needing to reach a standard set elsewhere. Every category that positions Africa as a latecomer to human civilization, has the historical relationship exactly backwards. Africa is the origin. The human story begins in Africa. Every other region of the world has been inhabited for a fraction of the time that Africa has been humanity's home. If we are ranking civilizations by seniority, and I do not think that is the right measure, then Africa wins. Overwhelmingly. Second, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece are chapters, not beginnings. The standard narrative of Western civilization traces itself to ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt, perhaps going back to Mesopotamia. But those civilizations, extraordinary as they are, existed in the most recent 1 to 2% of human history. The 98 to 99% that preceded them happened in Africa. We are not seeing the beginning when we study Greece. We are seeing a chapter that began 295,000 years after the story started. Third, African diversity is wealth. The 2,000 languages, the ecological diversity, the cultural pluralism. These are not signs of fragmentation or underdevelopment. They are the product of 300,000 years of creative human existence in the continent that has always been humanity's primary home. This diversity is the richest inheritance in human history. And fourth, the moral calculus. If Africa is the origin of all humanity, if every person alive today owes their existence to African ancestors, then the poverty and marginalization of contemporary Africa are not natural or deserved. They are the product of deliberate, documented, sustained extraction. Understanding the origin changes what justice requires. 8 things you now know that are backed by 70 years of converging scientific evidence. 1. Homo sapiens evolved in Africa 300,000 years ago. Not the Middle East. Not Europe. Not Asia. Africa. 2. The entire hominid lineage is African, not just us. Our ancestors going back 7 million years are African. 3. Africa's genetic diversity exceeds all other continents combined. The San people carry humanity's oldest known genetic lineages. 4. Mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam both lived in Africa. Your biology traces to them. You are of African descent. 5. 77% of human history happened in Africa before the out-of-Africa migration. Written history covers the last 1 to 2% of human existence. Everything before writing was African. 6. Human origins is a story of mixing. We interbred with Neanderthals. We interbred with Denisovans. The story is complex, multi-species, and still being revised with new discoveries. 7. Every major prehistoric innovation happened in Africa first. The first tools, the first symbolic art, the first jewelry, the first bow and arrow. Africa innovated first. Always. 8. There are no meaningful biological races. All humans are over 99.9% genetically identical. The differences are real but trivial. Recent adaptations to local environments. Scientific racism is ideology wearing the costume of science. It has no scientific basis. You are not from here. Wherever you are watching this, London, Lagos, Los Angeles, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, you are not originally from there. No human being is originally from anywhere except Africa. You are from Africa, not in the way that everyone is from the same universe, or the same stardust. More specifically than that, more recently than that. 300,000 years ago, which is, on an evolutionary timescale, the day before yesterday, your ancestors walked on African soil. They used African stone tools. They spoke a proto-language that carried the first words ever spoken in human history. They looked at the African sky, and they wondered, as we wonder now, what it all means. Every cell in your body carries the molecular memory of that beginning. The mitochondria that power your cells, inherited from your mother, from her mother, from her mother, in an unbroken chain, trace back to an African woman between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. This is not poetry. This is biochemistry. This is you. The world has done an extraordinary job of obscuring this fact. Schools do not teach it. History books skip it. The images that represent humanity are rarely African. The civilizations that are celebrated in public culture are not the oldest ones. But the science is clear. The evidence is in. The conclusion is not contested by any serious scientist anywhere on Earth. Africa is not where humanity went. It is where humanity came from. Subscribe to GriotWave Academy. Share this video. Tag someone who has never thought of themselves as African, and invite them to discover the truth that lives in every strand of their DNA. Asante, merci. Thank you. Before you go, help this message reach more people. If you learned something new today, like the video, subscribe for more deep dives, and share this with someone who still thinks Africa is a country. Small conversations can challenge big misconceptions, and every share helps expand understanding. If you want to explore this topic further, scan the QR code for additional resources, courses, recommended readings, maps, and extended discussions. There is far more to Africa than what can fit into a single episode, And this is only the beginning of a much deeper journey into the continent's history, cultures, people, and future. And if you'd like a deeper dive into any topic related to Africa or Pan-Africanism, leave a comment below and we'll cover it in a future video.